Hey, so this is the Drunkalogs, a podcast about addiction and recovery in which each guest shares their version of how it was, what happened, and how it is now, and then endures a half-hour Q&A at the hands of your host, Nick Morton. One of the great joys of this podcast has been reconnecting with old friends, and few have ever been closer to me than my next guest. We met in college where we drank ourselves nearly insane, and then continued to seek each other out as our paths diverged and then rejoined here in Los Angeles. He was a banker, and then an actor, and now he handles communications for a nonprofit. We had lost touch over the past several years, consumed by the obligation of family, and I watched from afar as he struggled with alcoholism. And I confess, I didn't hold out a lot of hope for him. But here he is 2 years sober after a long journey of just taking the next right step, and this interview is the best conversation we've ever had. Won't you please welcome Terry Brown.
So I grew up in Manchester, Mass, and North Shore, Boston, small town, and it was very idyllic, very small town, New England lifestyle. It was kind of an interesting mix of, like, it had a little bit of white collar and a little bit of blue collar.
And so was Manchester, was it a drinky culture? Cocktail?
Big time. Very, very big time. And, it's so funny because I didn't know any of this. I mean, the whole thing with recovery for me is this constant, shaking my head of just how did I not know so much? I had no idea. First of all, I had no idea that the rest of the world wasn't the same. I just assumed that everything was the same everywhere. And especially with drinking. I mean, my family, drinking was very common and accepted, and all the holidays and family events, and there was drinking, that was just part of everything. It was everywhere you went, there was drinking. It wasn't like ugly. It was just part of it, so it didn't stand out as this unusual or crazy, behavior. Now, looking back on it, it's a little baffling that more bad things didn't happen.
Sure.
Because everyone was drinking all the time. It was just the way. I mean, there was drinking at country club, there was drinking at the beach, there was drinking at parties. There were, as kids, we used to, steal booze from our parents and steal booze out of coolers and then go up to the beach at night and drink. And
do you
we
remember
hung out on
what the first one of those was where you were like, oh yeah, this is the fucking shiz?
Yeah, it was my very first time. I was 12. I was at a bar mitzvah in Maine on a lake. And I think I had 2, maybe 3 glasses of champagne. They were being passed around on a tray. And I thought, what the hell? I'm going to drink this stuff. Everyone else is. And I remember very specifically, we went on a little speedboat, and I was with a bunch of kids. They were a little bit older, like my sister's age, a year and a half, 2 years older than me. And I remember being so happy, and everything was crystallized by the sunlight and the water. And I remember turning to this other girl who was on the boat and being like, this is amazing. Why don't people do this every day? And now, of course,
now you know why.
I know why. Exactly. I found out the hard way.
Had you I mean, when I met you, you were a wildly popular kid. I mean, were you a popular kid all through, elementary school? I mean, did you have those feelings of less than or being left out that you hear people talk about so much in recovery?
Yeah, it is interesting. I hear that a lot, and I don't identify with it completely. Now, I will, to be very honest, I definitely wasn't like super confident as a younger kid.
Right.
Like I was sort of what you would guess, I would guess would be somewhat around average. Like I had my insecurities and I wasn't sure like how to be cool, or, you know, I wasn't like the best athlete, and I didn't, you know, so I wasn't like, you know, naturally super confident. But once like high school, junior high and high school started, and there was drinking and parties and girls, I definitely became very confident. And that was because I think the alcohol gave me that freedom. It gave me that like liquid courage. And so as I look back, like I didn't realize this at the time, but as I look back, I used that stuff, you know, like I used it to like become my identity, you know, like I was going to be the party guy. And, you know, I used it and it worked, you know, and then so I kept using it more. And yeah, so when I met you, I had been, we met freshman year in college. So I had been through maybe 4 years of, you know, high school years where I was drinking and partying and having a great time all the time. And the booze definitely gave me that confidence to feel good in a crowd and to, you know, not be bashful about meeting new people, and always having a good time and laughing a lot and acting silly and goofy. And it definitely gave me a lot of freedom.
Well, and it's funny that, like, I mean, obviously I was there for a lot of this, and like there weren't a lot of times when, like, you know, people didn't basically celebrate what we did. I mean that may sound self-centered, but like generally, I mean, I remember coming home to the apartment I shared with my roommate, who half the people who listen to this podcast will know who it is, but like, and finding you guys, it was like Halloween night. You guys were in togas and you were just like fucking covered in blood. Like there was blood everywhere. And like, my roommate told me this story. I mean, I don't totally remember it, but it was like you were somewhere and you were driving and like someone jumped on the hood of the car and then like someone turned and got flung off the car. And like, you know, you guys are there and it's like, I don't think you've been to the hospital and no one's going to the hospital. And like, no one gets, there's no consequences for it at all, except it's kind of hilarious. And I'm trying to think of another episode that is like, I mean, I just feel like there were a lot of episodes. I mean, there was a time, this is, I don't know if I should tell this story, but like, well, I came home to that same apartment and like, there was literally like human fecal matter had been like, this had nothing to do with you or my roommate, but like, it was all over the place. And I was like, what the fuck, what happened here? Like, I had been supposed to leave on a plane and my plane had been canceled. So I'd come back to the apartment and like some kid, I later found out some kid had tried to like scale the wall outside of our apartment and he was so fucked up and he fell and he cracked his back on the railing and shit himself. And he was, you know, blackout drunk. So then he ran into the apartment. Like, I mean, like if you hit your back so hard, you shit yourself, like, you're lucky to survive, I think. And, you know, like, I don't know. I mean, I joke, and I don't know if I've joked about it on this podcast or not, but that like, when I was growing up, like everyone drank all the time. Like, and
absolutely.
You know, that like in that culture, the only reason you ever did anything was so you could have a drink when it was over with, you know? It was like, let's go do this so we can get fucked up afterwards. Or, you know, or during
tennis. Yeah, tennis. Yeah, during it even more was like, let's go drink and go out on the boat, or let's go drink and go skiing, or let's go drink and go camping and hiking. And like, did you come with us on that camping trip where it was the hell climb or whatever? We were with you know, some friends in common. We're not saying names, but I remember we packed a cooler that was the size of a human coffin And then we parked the car. We drove all the way into like the middle of Virginia to like some national park or whatever. And then we dragged the thing like 100 yards and we're like, okay, this is good. We'll just camp here. We basically camped out on like the walkway to the park. Like,
and I mean,
go in.
It is this kind of like miracle of alcohol that it does make everything fine. You're like, this is weird. And then like a couple drinks later, you're like, this is the best place I've ever been. Like,
yes.
in some like alley behind a fucking wall, whatever. And you're like, you're just like, this is our party spot. You're like, what?
Yeah. It gives it all some like humor and meaning, and it sort of makes it all glisten. It's all great.
And like, I do wonder, like, I mean, when I got sober, and obviously we'll get to this, but like, I mean, I had a failure of imagination to believe there was a life worth living that didn't involve booze. And
absolutely, I can totally relate to that. Like there was no way. It was not an option. There was nothing. I mean, I love that you said it's a failure of imagination. Like there was nothing beyond.
Right. It's like,
life with alcohol.
I live in Los Angeles, and it's like, wait, we're going to go to the observatory and not get fucked up. Like, why are we even going there? Like,
yeah.
Why would you do anything? Like we did like everything you did fucked up, or you did it as a means to get fucked up. So like, and I mean, sometimes I look back on my, like high school and college and just wonder if my priorities had been different, like what my life might have looked like. What if I had gotten high, acting or something? Like what if I had taken that energy and put it into something that actually like fed my soul? I mean, because at the time it felt like booze fed our souls, And,
yeah, the thing is, one thing that I will say about that like it kind of one of the things that is sort of, I don't know, it's like I don't want to glorify or glamorize the abusing of alcohol, but one of the things that came out of all that time was relationships, friendships. And I don't know, because I've only had my life experience, not someone else's to compare it to, but I think that like going through all those antics and wild and crazy and sort of ridiculous moments, it makes those relationships, there's a lot of bonding, and there's a lot of color and richness in it, so that those friendships seemed very, very solid. Now, would they have been just the same or maybe even better without all the emphasis on drinking and partying? Maybe. I don't know. But something tells me that part of the reason that I have such deep and lasting friendships with so many of my childhood and friends from home and friends from college like you is because we did so much. We adventured so much. And I don't know, like, was the booze the cause or the effect? I don't know. But there's something to speak of about that. Like, it did lend itself to very intense friendships.
The war stories, it's like, I remember when we were touring the Dead, and I'd be like, these are our war stories, like ODing on mushrooms and waking up behind a police station and being like, wow, that was fucked up. So you graduate from college. I know that this happened because I was there for it. And then what was the plan? I don't remember that.
So the plan was, that's a good question. My first job, I worked in the White House, and that was very exciting. And I remember the very first day, this higher up, like the boss's boss, I walked in and he's like, do you realize how screwed you are? And I'm like, sir, what? And he's like, this is going to be the most exciting job you'll ever have. And all the rest of them are going to suck. And to some extent, he was right. It was a very exciting job, and I got to travel around, and it was all very exciting. And so the plan was to live in DC and be in the world of politics. And it was all really fascinating. And I ended up working for a professor of mine from college. And I stayed in DC and I really had fun. And it was like the party didn't really stop. It just kind of changed. It was like partying after work instead of partying after class.
Right. And did it complicate your professional life at that point or no?
Not at that point.
Right.
I remember I broke my foot doing chicken fights in a pool and on one weekend, and I had to show up at work on crutches. And I worked for some people who were, like they were higher up the food chain and they were important people. And I kind of felt a little silly on my crutches.
Right.
So I said, oh, I broke it running. I was running trail running. And one of the guys was like this super smart guy who had worked at the CIA, and he was like the executive director of the organization. And he was like, well, but that doesn't make any sense because the PSI from when you're running couldn't have snapped this bone on your foot.
Wow.
And I just remember looking at him and being like, yeah, I don't really know about that. And just kind of crutched my way out of his office. And I was kind of busted. But yeah, I mean, so other than that, like the little moments like that, like it didn't really get in the way yet. But that did happen.
And then what do you do?
So then I went off to business school, and that was in New York City at NYU. And the partying and the addiction sort of definitely stepped up a notch. Like, and it was definitely, there were those moments where I started to notice that my behavior was different than others. And, it'd be 2 a.m. and people would want to go home. And I'd be like, no way, you can't go home. It's only 2 a.m. And then it'd be 4 a.m. and there'd be like a few people left. And I'd start to get that feeling of like, oh no, it's going to be over. Like people are going to start to leave, that sinking feeling. And I know, and I really looked forward to the weekends, and we would party all night, and it was very fun. And it didn't really compromise. Like again, like you said, there weren't really that many consequences. There really weren't any consequences that I could see at this point. But I started sensing that like this wasn't going to end well. Like I definitely do this to the extreme, and I never want to go home and go to bed and, act like a normal person.
Did you feel like you got some real shit out of business school? Like, was that a good move?
That's a great question. I did. So I went there because I wanted to learn about economics, and I was like working in the foreign policy world for a former ambassador to the UN, and all the foreign policy work was based on these trade deals, NAFTA and GATT, and I didn't understand economics the way I felt like I needed to. So I was like, I'm going to go to business school, and my boss was very impressed with that, like choosing that instead of law school. She was, very supportive. And so in a sense, like I learned about economics and macroeconomics, and that was really cool. And I'm glad I did that. But did I need to spend 2 years and I don't know, over $100,000 in order to do that? No, I probably could have taken a few classes and achieved the same result. So no, and again, like if I look back, like, and I've been to some treatments where they've had you kind of look back and say, like, how did your drinking affect your decisions? And when I look back, like that was one of the first times that I could see that, like, I went to business school because I wanted to be in New York City. or I chose the school because I wanted to be in New York City because I wanted to party, not because
Right.
I really thought that was the right school for me, and so it was good that I did it, and I ended up getting some, good jobs from it, and I had some, interesting educational benefits from it. But I was, the dog was wagging the tail already there. Like, I was in New York because I wanted to party, not because that was the right school for me.
And so then I remember you ended up working at a big bank, and then you came to Los Angeles ostensibly.
Yeah. So the bank,
I remember you and I had like a pretty hard night, coke fueled night somewhere in there when you were in New York, and you were saying you were going to come to Los Angeles. And what was, I can't remember, like, what triggered that? Like, what was the whole thing? Like,
well, I think I started to definitely get a little off track. And so so when I was at business school, I got recruited into this Wall Street bank, and I didn't really want to do that, but I figured, this is a great opportunity, and I'll just do it for, this summer in between the business school years. And then after the summer, they offered me the position full time. And I was like, well, they're going to send me to Italy. I really wanted to go live in Italy, and they did that. So I kind of was like, I took the job, and I knew it wasn't really right for me, but I thought of it as a short-term thing that would be really interesting. And I'd get to go live overseas as an expat. And I'd always dreamed of doing that. And so I did, and that was amazing. And it was really fun. But then once I had done that and I had been overseas for a year, I was living in Milan, and I came to visit you in Los Angeles because, yes, I had started taking acting classes while I was in business school because I really didn't like business school, and I really didn't like working in an investment bank. And my sister, who's a professional athlete, had encouraged me to develop my creative side. So I figured I'm going to take an acting class, and I took it with our other friend, Luke Grant. Remember him? And we had a great time in acting class, and it was, I just felt so alive, and I was so into it, and I loved it. And I was like, this is what I should be doing. So I basically decided I'm not going to do this Wall Street thing. I'm going to become an actor. Right. And I've got to get myself from Milan to Los Angeles. So I was able to finagle a job within the bank in Los Angeles. So you helped me enormously, and you helped me find my place to live, which was the swingers house,
the infamous Temple Hill house.
The infamous Temple Hill house, which was, it couldn't be more cliche in terms of, like, you're in your late 20s and you move to Los Angeles, and your best friend who lives out there and is in the movie business hooks you up with a bunch of friends, and they're all these fun guys who party just like we do. And it was just another chapter of debauchery and fun and excitement and craziness, and all these fun people, and meeting actors and writers and directors and agents. And it was, in this beautiful old house up in the Hollywood Hills, right below the Hollywood sign. I mean, it was crazy, and it was really fun. And they had just previously, I think it was just like 2 years prior, they had filmed the big party scene in the movie Swingers in this very house where I was living. That you,
the house is, before you guys lived there, Marty Bowen and Wick Godfrey lived there, and it had such an impact on them. They named their production company Temple Hill Productions, which produced the fucking Twilight Saga. It's hilarious. Like that house now goes on to have this like permanent place in Hollywood history.
Yeah. And I see people's names, like, I see people's names on films and directors. And people that I met that lived there after I did or before
Right.
I did. And it's almost like a fraternity of sorts.
Totally.
I mean, it was amazing. And again, like really fun, not a ton of consequences, not really many consequences, but still this sneaking sense that, something's not quite right. Like I'm still staying up till 5 a.m. every weekend. And then I'd have to get up to go to work at first. When I moved there, I was working at the bank, and everyone else was in the movie industry, and I'm working at the bank, and I felt like such a loser, and I didn't fit in. And I woke up in the morning every morning, and the first thought that would go through my head was this just bleak thought of just fuck. Like that was how I woke up every morning. Like that's the way I felt. And then I would get dressed and I'd put on my suit and I'd drive. It took me 40 minutes to go 6 miles to downtown Los Angeles. And I just didn't want to be there. I didn't want to be there at all. And I started sort of gathering little notes for my one-man show that I would someday, and eventually I did, write about the experience working in the big corporate bank. And I just had a bad attitude, and it was ironic because I remember going into this guy's office, and he was the meanest, most lazy, apathetic, rude guy. He was like the epitome of a corporate. He was like an accountant or like an underwriter or something of some contracts that I had to get from my client. And every once in a while I have to go into his office and sit there. And he was just so negative and nasty. And I remember looking up on a shelf in his office, and there was a little knickknack, and it said, "Attitude is everything. Pick a good one." And I felt like jamming it into his face and being like, "Why don't you listen to this?" But yeah, the bank was, it was the opposite of what I wanted to be doing. And so my rule was, I've got to get a part in something, some movie, some film, some play, something, in order to quit this job. And so it took me 9 months, and eventually I got a part in a really bad movie that I don't even think ever made it anywhere. But I got a part, and it was called Post Op. And it was like a bad horror movie about somebody who goes crazy in their post op, and it was shot in like a defunct insane asylum.
Oh, right.
But I got out of my job and I got into the film world and, the entertainment business. And I was very happy for many years doing that. And that was a struggle. And I think, as I struggled more and more to make a real living in that business, and I partied harder and harder and got older and older, and people started moving on and having marriages and children and lives and careers, and I didn't. I think I started to lean more and more on the booze to sort of maybe paper over the fact that I wasn't really moving ahead, at least to myself, and then the consequences started to set in.
Right.
I got a couple DUIs, and that was brutal. I mean, living in Los Angeles, even if it was temporary, without a car, and the humiliation of that amongst friends, it wasn't cool. I remember being in a play, and I was backstage, and there were 14 of us, and we were all changing after the play out of our costumes, wardrobes, into our regular street clothes. And I said to somebody was like, "Oh, can I get a ride home? I'm not driving because I have a DUI." And I was like, "Oh, I had one of those." And somebody else was like, "So did I." And so did I. And I remember 11 out of the 14 of us all had a DUI. And I remember thinking, that's not a normal statistic. 11 out of 14 people. But that was, again, you go back to like the culture, like LA, the culture for people in our age group at the time. I mean, it's what people did. You drank, you partied.
It's funny.
It was the way of life.
I didn't get sober until I was 40. And then I started doing stand up somewhere after that. And our stand up teacher, my stand up teacher was like, at the start of the thing was like, if you ever go on stage fucked up, you're out of this class. And I was like, wait, what? I was sober and I was like, oh, that's great. But I don't know, man. I mean, like, part of me like looks back on that and I was like, oh, if I'd had that kind of influence earlier, like I might have recognized that like drugs and booze were doing more damage to me than help. But
yeah. And I remember thinking, like, at one point I did that one man show that I mentioned earlier. And I remember thinking, like, well, I was writing the show. It wasn't finished yet. It took me a long time to write it. And I remember thinking, well, am I going to need to like drink before I do this show?
right.
Because if I don't drink, like, it might not be funny.
Right.
And I remember like really having that conversation, and I wasn't joking. Like, I was like concerned.
What did you decide?
No, I never drank ever before performing. There was only one show where it was like my theater group would have this Christmas party and we would perform the Tuna Christmas, which is this sort of, silly show, and everybody would trade costumes. And it was the idea that was that everyone was drinking because it was more of a party and we were all in the theater, in the group and doing the show together for each other. But that was the only time I ever did anything for work where I had been drinking. But I remember thinking, like, what if I'm successful? Like, what am I going to do? Because I won't be able to do it without drinking.
Right.
Well, and I never had that problem because I never became successful. So I never had to test the theory. But I remember thinking, like, this is going to be an issue for you. And then it wasn't until I got into my late 40s that it really became a problem, because I got married. And I got married in my late 30s, but it became a problem in my mid 40s when we had kids. And you guys
got married. You guys got married, and I remember you were living in the little tree house in Beechwood Canyon.
Totally. That thing was awesome. The bungalow.
My daughter had just been born. I remember coming up there and having like a cup of coffee with your wife and your mother-in-law. And it wasn't that soon after that you guys left.
Yep.
And what was what was going on at that point that you were like, we got to get the fuck out?
Well, that was sort of a part of the plan, was if we're going to have kids, we're going to want to go back east and do it in a small town.
Right.
And that was our thinking was, if we're going to do this, Monique, my wife, is from New York City, and I had lived in cities, since childhood. I spent my whole childhood in small town New England, but then as an adult, it was DC, New York, Milan, Los Angeles. And I had never been back to small town America since I was like 14, to live. And we both wanted that. So we took a huge, crazy leap, and we moved to Maine, to a house that we had barely seen when we bought it, to a town that we barely knew. And we got there and we didn't have jobs. We both had to get jobs. And my wife had a baby within 6 weeks of when we got there. So it was crazy. We moved into a home, had a child, got jobs, moved across country from Los Angeles to small town Maine. And it was a culture shock. I mean, I always say it was more bizarre to LA was more different than from New York City than Milan was. Like living in Los Angeles was just such a different culture.
Right.
It
Sure.
was more of a change than living in Europe.
Yeah.
And so, yes, to move to Maine, it was crazy.
I don't want to like dwell on the like the shittiness of Hollywood, lack of success, but like, I mean, living out here, I just can't help but like, I mean, it's such a compelling dream, and like to walk away from that was was Mo like, dude, it's not happening. Like, you've got a handful of DUIs and a drinking problem. Like, you need to get out of here. Or was that even part of the conversation at that point? Like,
it wasn't quite the conversation yet.
right.
It was more like I wanted out because it wasn't happening career wise.
Sure.
And I was like, I'm going to go and live in New England and raise a family and do a different life. And right. I'm going to walk away from this dream because I gave it all I had, and I did it for 10 years. And I had enough small successes that I felt okay about it,
right.
about leaving it.
Right.
But dude, it was hard. I mean, but the thing is, like, I had sort of come to that conclusion before I even got married. You know, like I sort of knew, like, okay, because when I was living in LA, like I was like, I'm not getting married. I'm doing this. I'm going to live in a garage apartment for the rest of my life. I'm going to be an actor. I'm going to be by myself. I'll be accountable to no one, and I'm going to make it. Right. And I worked really hard, and I didn't make it, you know, and I finally was like, okay, I'm allowing myself to get married, have a family, try something normal, because this isn't working.
Did you ever now blame your like boozing and using for Hollywood disappointment?
I don't, but I probably could, you know, like I haven't been that introspective, but like, if I were honest about it, like, yeah, those 10 years, I focused a lot more on having fun and partying, and then trying to get out of those DUIs, like trying to, pay the bills and,
were you successful? Were you successful at getting out of that shit?
Well, no, not getting out of, but getting through. Do you know what I mean? Like surviving the damage. Luckily nobody got hurt. But yeah, I mean, I spent thousands of dollars and lawyers and all that, and I had to go to treatment and rehab and all that, and I didn't take it seriously. And had I had a better attitude and done it differently, then I maybe I would have been more successful as an actor. I don't know, that business is so hit or miss that, I could still be there today working my brains out sober and maybe never make it, I don't know.
Totally.
But and so I feel like the consequences really started when I moved into a small town and was trying to raise children and be a husband and have a regular job. I couldn't do it. I couldn't do it. I became miserable. I became resentful. I was just storybook cliched alcoholic. Like, I blamed everybody else for all my problems. I didn't take responsibility. I didn't know that that's what I was doing. Right, but sure. Now that I'm sober, I look at it and I'm like, oh yeah.
Clearly, what did your drinking look like at that point?
It wasn't as treacherous as like all the crazy party days.
Right.
It was just pathetic. It was just lonely and sad. And so it would look like after work, I would go to the bar for a few drinks on the way home. And then I'd put the kids to bed and then maybe drink another bottle of wine by myself,
Right.
like watching TV. Like there was nothing exciting happening. And I was then lying and hiding it and hiding it and denying it. And, I'd go into the garage and chug a half a bottle of wine and then come back in like nothing happened. And it was just.
And are people in your life being like, dude, you're out of control, like you need to stop drinking? Like,
yes, but not a lot of people, because I wasn't really around a lot of people who knew me that well. It was just my wife.
right.
Those early days of raising kids, you're
You're
full
just by
time
yourself.
on duty. Yeah. And so I drove my wife crazy, and, thank God she stuck with me, because I don't know if I would have done the same thing.
Right.
And and I can't even imagine like how disappointing and frustrating that must have been for her. Because to see somebody just kind of giving up, basically, and then, but not even being, man enough to acknowledge that that's what I was doing. I was just drinking a lot. It just wasn't pretty. And I wasn't really doing much of anything.
And what happened? Like what was the breaking point?
Well, it was a long process for me. I fought, and I was just so did not want to give up my right to drink. I clung to it so hard. I was so sure that I had to have it and that I couldn't live without it, that I defended that right to drink so hard. At one point my wife said, "You've got to go get help. This is getting ridiculous." Like I would go to a Christmas party and make a total fool of myself, and she would be mad, and I would think she was being overreacting. And then finally she's like, you got to get out. So she put the ultimatum. And so I went to rehab, and I fought it kicking and screaming for the first 10 days. And then I finally was like, you know what? You're here. Why don't you try to listen? And so I listened, and I realized, like, yeah, I definitely am an alcoholic, but and I'm going to do what they tell me to do, because I want to go back home and be with my kids and my family and have my life back.
Right.
But in the back of my mind, I always knew I was going to drink again, so I wasn't quote unquote ready, but right. I couldn't admit that. So I was in this awful conundrum of just like, I want to get sober, but not for me. I want to do it so that other people change their behavior toward me.
Right. So everyone gets all like fucking back.
Yeah. And as we know, that doesn't work, so I had to figure that out the hard way. So it took me 6 years in recovery of trying and failing and trying and failing. And I would go for months, and then I would bail, and then I would get a few more months, and then I'd give up, or, and there'd be like, there would be incidents where I'd get really drunk and embarrass myself, but it wasn't enough to like scare me. And then finally what happened was I got a DUI with my kids in the car, and it was the worst incomprehensible demoralization. Like that's the best way to describe it. I just couldn't believe it. I was in shock. Like even to this day, when I talk about it, I still don't even know if it really happened, because it was just so horrible. I loved those kids so much, with like in a way that I can't describe, but yet I would still drink and drive with them, and I couldn't reconcile that. And so that for me finally was the gift of desperation that they talk about in recovery, but it was also the gift of like, I could finally see that I really was insane, because
why did they pull you over?
It was snowy and I was swerving, and
right.
I had a new car, so I didn't really know how to work the the defroster, and
Right.
I was like looking down trying to figure out how to get because it was snowing early. It was like late October, and it was not a normal time to be snow.
Right.
And I had this car with no snow tires, and I was driving home from soccer practice, and I should, have been going slower and watching where I was going, but instead I was swerving because I was playing around with the controls. And thank God they pulled me over, because I never would have stopped drinking if something like that didn't happen. And I immediately knew, like, it was just a light switch went off in my brain. I was like, okay, this is it. If I mean, basically what it came down to was I was so humiliated in front of my kids and so sad that I had done that to them. They were 7 and 10 years old at the time. And I thought about killing myself. I was like, I can't face it. But then I only thought about that for like 2 seconds, because I thought to myself, I can't do that to them. That's the worst thing I could do to them. So then I was like, my only option is to show them how to step up and take responsibility and fix the damage that I caused. And so I've been on this crusade to kind of show them, like, you can mess up and you can recover and you can fix it.
I mean, that's a huge lesson. I mean, God, if you, as a parent, if you can convey that, it's worth it,
Every once in a while, when I think about them having to witness, being in the backseat of a car when your father gets arrested, I get depressed. And then I immediately just say to myself, well, I have an opportunity to teach them a really powerful lesson. And that's how I'm going to live it.
What were the consequences of that? I mean, did they like call Mo and be like, you got to come pick up your kids?
Yeah. They put the kids in another car and drove them home in the back of a police car.
It's horrible.
It's horrible. It's horrible. I mean, I can't even really talk about it without just shuddering, because I just can't believe that I was that guy.
And then what happened to you? I mean,
I went to jail. I went to jail for the night, and the next day my wife came and bailed me out. And, she didn't really look at me for the next couple of days, but I immediately quit my job and started going to AA meetings morning, noon, and night. And because I knew, I was like,
what was your job at that point? What were you doing?
I was working as a communications director for a nonprofit in Maine, and it was a fun, exciting job. I got to do a lot of media and some travel, and this economics forum, and it was fun and interesting. And I did not want to leave the job, but I didn't have a choice. I knew if I don't work full time at getting sober, I'm not going to make it. And frankly, I remembered I was scheduled to go to a conference like 10 days later. And these conferences were very boozy, swanky, fun affairs. And I was like, there's no way I could go to it and not drink. And there's no way if I go to it and drink that I'm going to survive, like that I'm going to be able to get sober. Like I had to get sober. It was life or death for me at that point, because I was like, this is the only way that I can move forward as a father. I just felt like I didn't have a choice, and it was great. I needed that. It needed to be that stark for me.
Were there did the state get involved in your parenting at that point? Like, you've been arrested with kids in your car. Like, was there like a...
Yes, they came to the house and they sat down and they interviewed me and they interviewed my wife and they interviewed our kids.
Oh my God.
It was horrible. It was horrifying. I can't even think of good adjectives to put next to it, because it was just the worst. It was the worst. And it was so bad that it just blew me into the next stratosphere where I needed to go, which was like, I have to change.
And at what point did they give you a clean bill of health?
The state?
The state.
Yeah, so they basically did those interviews, and then that was it. They said, we can see that you're, that this does not need further monitoring,
And
luckily,
right. And were there legal ramifications, like beyond the usual DUI stuff? Like you lose your license and whatever, it's a fucking drag and you've got to pay.
Yeah, nothing beyond that. But I mean, it was a lot because right. I had done this a few times now. Right. And so, luckily it was spaced out enough that it didn't I didn't have to go to jail for 6 months or something. But it was a lot. And it took a toll on the family. It took a toll on my finances. It took a toll on my sense of pride, which, frankly, I think it was a positive toll on my sense of pride. I think I needed to be brought down to earth and to be shown that I can't live that way. It's not going to work. And I guess up until then, somehow I was delusional enough to think that somehow I could have it all. I could be an alcoholic who drinks and doesn't ruin my life, and as much as we're told that that's not possible, I guess I thought I was different,
You talked a little bit more about how dark it got, and whatever, we can cut this if it's too much, but just the idea of wanting to quit and not being able to quit, and then doing shit like hiding your drinking, drinking in your car when everyone thinks that you're sober, and you've got a family, and just the just what that was like. I mean,
absolutely. Yeah.
Because it's intense.
It is intense. And, it's funny, as you're asking this question, what's coming to mind is this sort of strange sounding response, but it was dark and it was bad. And I wasn't living nearly the life that I wanted to, that I knew I could, that I had previously in my life.
Right.
I just wasn't living up to my own expectations, my own standards. And it was just that gradual sort of decay of my physical health, my mental health. And I just wasn't, but because I was truly alcoholic, I didn't see how bad it was. So the delusion, in a way, was I knew, but I didn't quite feel how bad it was, because I think, to some extent I was masking it with the drinking. And so what's a little strange is that, of course, when everything fell apart and I truly did hit that cliched rock bottom, I really did, I got arrested with my kids in the car. I mean, what could be worse than that? I mean, well, what could be worse is if somebody got hurt or killed. So I shouldn't be melodramatic, but it was really, really horrible. And I felt like I did have this moment of clarity. And I honestly, even that day, I think I felt I'm so glad this happened, because I can finally let go of this idea that this isn't a massive, huge, life-threatening problem. But to try to answer your question, I think now I can see how bleak it was more clearly than I could then, because then I was still delusional. Do you know what I'm saying? It's a weird thing. And I don't even know if it really makes sense.
No, but it's interesting. I mean, because we weren't really in touch much during those darkest years, but I would get reports of, whatever, Terry's gotten sober or Terry's relapsed, and they talk in these meetings about physical craving, like the power of physical craving. And to me, like my physical craving, when I somehow miraculously came to the conclusion that I was going to stop drinking and started going to meetings, my craving just, it wasn't that strong. Like the thing I'm craving is, I don't know. It feels like a classic, like whatever hole in my soul that I'm trying to fill with alcohol. But when I would hear about your story, I'm like, oh, that's like, like it sounded like a physical addiction, but the way you talk about it, and I mean, whatever, we can, parse what physical addiction is versus emotional or mental addiction. But the idea, like I always imagined this, like when I would hear a story, like whatever, Terry disappeared from a party and then he returned drunk, because I think I heard some story like that. And then it's like to me, like the amount of stealth and secrecy involved in like perpetrating that, and then the shame of being found out seems so intense. And I'm just curious if that was the experience, or if it was like the way you talk about it, it sounds like it was something completely different.
No, it's you know what it is? It's like yes, and like, yes, it was awful. And that's I mean, you just brought me back to like, there were so many times I would like go to friends' houses and be like, I'm not drinking. And then after like 2 hours, I'd be like, sneak off to the bar and like pour myself like 2 glasses of vodka, and then just return to the party as if everything was fine. And I'm sure everybody knew, and yes, there was guilt, shame, remorse. Like that was awful. And I felt like an idiot and a loser, and I just hated myself. But what's even more, what's strange about it is that it seems even more bleak now that I'm sort of like you were describing, is that like freedom from that craving. I'm having that freedom, but I'm also just having this clarity of like just how sad it was and how distressing it was for those people around me. And I guess when you're in it, it definitely was bleak and it sucked, but now it sucks worse from here than it did when I was there, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, well,
because
I mean,
now
I feel like until you get sober, there is this like perception that like there is no other way. Like this is just how you manage a life. And
that's it.
It's terrible that
it.
Everyone wants me to be at this party and be sober, but like I don't believe that that's like it just doesn't seem possible.
And,
like,
it really
seems crazy. Like
torturous.
You're right.
And the point is, like, I would go to the party and I'd be there sober for a couple hours and I'd be like, okay, I did that. Now I'm going to go have a couple drinks. You know what I mean? Like it wasn't possible. Like, it's not just that it didn't seem possible. It physically was not possible. I didn't allow it to happen because I couldn't, and that I did not know how.
That is sort of fascinating to me. And it's a great segue because like, the question then I was thinking about is like, what is the difference? Like, how is it that life is now possible for you? And like, how, like on a daily basis, I guess, like, what do you do to stay sober?
Well, you asked the $1 million question, right? Like, what was the thing? I mean, my wife kept asking me like, what is the, like, how are you going to get this? Or why aren't you getting it? And everyone else is, or then when I did, like, what do you think was the thing? And now I have people coming to me and asking me like, how did you do, And so for me, I think everyone's experience is definitely a little different. It's like, we all get the flu, but it's a different thing for everyone, right? Like, not that this is the flu, but it's just how we're all just different people and we have different ways of being, and our health is all different too. And so what I did was I just kept going. Like, I didn't give up. And I don't attribute that to any strength of character. I attribute it to what happened was it got so bad that I think I told you about this already, but I woke up that day after being, having the rug pulled out from under me. And I was just like, okay, like it's over. Like I don't have any other choice. Like I must get sober. I think I told you, I've thought about killing myself, but then that wasn't an option because of my kids. And I was like, well, I'm not going to do that. That's the only thing I could do worse, And so I have to get better because I have to show them that this is how a man lives his life. You take responsibility for your mistakes. And then once I had that sort of turning point, I just worked the program. Like I stopped editing. I stopped doing my version of, recovery and listening to people in recovery programs. And I just did what the sponsor told me. And I stopped editing, like I would catch myself like reading, some of these spiritual readings or prayers or, these steps. And I'd be like, well, it's kind of like that, but it's a little bit like, and then I'd be like, no, Terry, just stop, and I would just stop editing everything and analyzing things. And I just let myself listen to someone else for a change.
Right.
And then the program actually worked the way it's supposed to, just in, like many programs of recovery or probably other disciplines, right? Like if you just focus on what's right in front of you and don't get grandiose about it. And don't, for me, this whole thing is about not listening to my thinking, because my thinking tells me like, well, you could do this, or why don't you change it this way? Or what about that? And instead I just do what's in front of me, what they tell me to do, which is just basically go to the meetings, listen, do what they tell you to, which is, and basically I what they talk about in recovery a lot is surrender. Like I just stopped trying to be in charge of my recovery, of my life. I was like, I'm just going to do this. And then just like they promised, everything else just fell back into place. And because I wasn't there sabotaging it.
Do you find yourself like tempted to drink at this point?
No, it's weird. I mean, there are these little moments where I get these ideas, but they're like compulsive thoughts. And then now that I've trained myself to sort of check my thoughts before like believing them, I just go, oh, there it is. There's my, alcoholic thinking wants me to go get a drink. And then I actually think about the actual drink, and I'm like, it won't even, like, if it does taste good, which it probably won't, it's not going to give me the desired effect. Like that's the thing that really helped me. And I hate to say it, was because I drank for so long that it wasn't working at the end. Like when I would go off and sneak and drink, it didn't make me feel good. It just made me feel like crap, so I wouldn't get what I was looking for anyway. So,
and do you meditate?
Yes. So I have a pretty strict program that I follow. Every day I wake up and I pray, and then I go down to my little home office and I read a bunch of spiritual readings. Some of it's kind of like spiritual stuff that's recovery, and some of it's just spiritual books that I've gotten from friends, and I'll read a few pages here or there. And then there's some books that I have like daily devotionals, like a you read the page of the calendar day, and those always blow me away. Like I'm always surprised at how surprised I am about how good they are and how wise they are and how mind opening and refreshing that wisdom can be. And then I meditate on some of the readings, and that can be as simple as, a 5-minute meditation some days. Even a 2-minute meditation if I have to like get busy, but sometimes I'll do 20-30 minutes. And then sometimes I go to meetings where I meditate, and it really helps me. Like I've had meditations where I go off into this sort of outer body experience, but that's not what I have on a normal basis. Normally, it's basically me just getting quiet and trying to listen instead of listen to my thoughts. Somebody once said to me that praying is talking to God and meditating is listening to God. And I kind of like that. That helps me keep it simple. And then the other thing I do is I talk to my sponsor a lot, not every day anymore, but I did every day for like 9 months, or no, for over a year. And then, so I talk to him a lot, and I communicate with all sorts of friends in recovery. And I also sponsor other guys who call me a lot. And, I help them do, some of the step work. Or I just talk to them about their lives. Like today, I've talked to 3 different guys, and some of it's just fun banter, and some of it's like one guy just called me because he had a fight with his business partner, and he just needed to vent, and I just have this gift of these people in what they call a fellowship, and it's like people who are there to help each other, and it's super, it's very surprisingly helpful, and it's positive. It's like these great little experiences throughout the day.
I guess the thing that always surprises me and that I wish I were better at is like, I don't know, I still expect everything to be easy. Like that my happiness is my natural state, peace is my natural state, that success is my natural state, and that the thing I fail to do again and again is to acknowledge that those things aren't less real because I worked for them, because I chose them, I mean, meditation helps me so much, but I cannot for the life of me meditate. I wish I was better at it. I wish practice felt more natural to me. Like practice has always been a fucking drudgery to me. Like the idea that I can't just play piano like a maestro stopped me in my tracks when I was 7. The idea that writing is so much work to me is just sometimes just flattens me with paralysis and self-loathing. But I need to hear it over and over again that practicing these habits actually is a path towards peace.
Well, it's funny because maybe the reason it has worked for me so well in the past couple of years is because it got so bad that I was willing, like somebody said the change happens when the pain gets great enough. Right. And so it got so bad for me that I worked pretty hard to get away from that pain once it happened. And it's funny that you said the idea of happiness is supposed to be the natural state. I was definitely raised that way. Everything's supposed to be perfect. And then if something goes wrong, it has to be immediately fixed. And then you return to perfect. And that's a screwed up way to live because it's not real. So then I became an adult and I realized that's not possible. So, this is not going to work on a daily basis. Every day is going to be a disaster if I'm expecting it to go perfectly. And then I'm supposed to just correct the errors. So I've kind of had to relearn a lot of that stuff. And now I'm life is just what it comes at me. It doesn't, I don't believe my thinking when I say to myself, oh, I'm a victim, and when stuff goes wrong with my kids, they don't do what I want them to do, or they don't act the way I want them to act. I no longer start to get angry. I mean, of course I feel that occasionally, but it's not my go-to. My go-to might be anger. And then I'll check that and I'll go, I wonder what I can do to help them.
Yeah. That
it's just
a lot of work.
It takes a lot of work. And I'm not there all the time.
My rage at my children is like it's like a super tanker. And once it starts moving, it is very, very hard to stop it. And so like I really try to like never get that thing moving, because sometimes I'm like, oh, here it comes. Stop it. You got to stop it. And I'm like, I'll hold it back for like 15 seconds, which maybe even makes it worse when it finally like finds its expression in like a freaking gorilla scream at my children. And they're like,
no, that is like such a perfect description. I had that feeling the tanker was coming the other night at dinner. I think it was just last night. And I was like, okay, here it is. And I could see it. And I was like, okay. And I just folded up my hands and put my head down. And I was just like, I'm going to blow up, and I'm making this about me. And so I just was like, I just checked out. I just went silent for like 2 minutes. And then I took a few deep breaths. And then I was like, and then I kind of raised my voice a little, but it was barely a temper tantrum compared to what the tanker was. But that's a perfect description. So like, yeah, these tools help me, but more than anything, it's the daily maintenance of the spiritual condition, which is like just reminding myself that I am just a guy who's living his life, who's doing the best he can, and it's not going to be perfect. And as soon as I start getting woe is me, I just immediately catch myself and I'm like, what can I do to help somebody else? Now, I'm not saying I like run out and help little ladies on the street. Like, I'm not a saint, but I have been taught that like when I start thinking about myself, my job is to go help someone else. So
that's good advice.
Like it helps me. Like it's not like I'm,
Right, yeah. No, it's purely I mean, it's
purely
like,
selfish.
I mean, I hate to say it, but it's like, yeah, I'm helping you because like I need to help you. Like
I have to.
Yeah,
absolutely.
Because
like
it's gonna make me feel better, and like
it's my high. That's my drink.
Let me ask you one other question, which I hadn't thought about, but I mean, what is your conception of a higher power?
It's interesting. I find now that I have a relationship with God, it's definitely my own conception of a higher power. It's not much like the one that I learned about in, Episcopalian confirmation classes when I was a kid, and Episcopalian boarding school. And then you and I both went to a Jesuit college together. And those classes were interesting, but I was not religious. I mean, I was raised in a church background, but I was not, quote unquote, very religious. And the fact that I was open to religion as an idea and spirituality interested me was helpful, because I didn't have some horrible upbringing where I hated it. And so I had to sort of like totally like deconstruct that and come back to it. But my relationship with God now is I ask God to show me what his will is. So it's not like, God, please help me get this job. God, please help me not scream at my wife. It's, God, please show me how to deal with whether or not I get this job. Or, God, please show me how to be kind when I feel like screaming at my wife. So it's like, it's this very modest way that I was taught by others in recovery. It's like, God is not there to like do your shopping. It's not Santa Claus. But it is a way to humble yourself and just realize like there is something bigger going on in the universe, that powers science and all the stars and cosmos. And I don't know what it is, and I don't need to know. And it's also like, I don't need to know exactly how my alcoholism works. Like, I understand some of it and some of it I don't understand. But what I do know is that somebody somewhere bigger than me knows more about all this stuff than I do. And that's, for me, that's the supernatural. That's God. And so I just need to humble myself and realize, like, I'm not the one running the show. Like my job is to, like, I love the simple analogy I've heard is I paddle, he steers, so like I show up and do the work, and there's something bigger at work. And I like that, it's spiritual.
Do you feel that God ever shows you the way?
Yeah. And here's how, like, no, in the sense of, like, it's not clear, but like I can, it's almost like what we were talking about at the beginning of the conversation. Like, looking back now, it was more bleak now that I can see how bleak it was. And it's the same with getting shown the way. It's like I won't get a certain job, and then I'll be like, this is awful. And then something better comes along, and I'm like, oh, there it is. God had my back. And, I knew at the time, and somebody said that to me, and I kind of scoffed, but here it is,
Yeah. I mean, I have that experience a lot where, like, in retrospect, I'm like, oh, that all worked out in a great way. And I had nothing to do with it. Like, all my choices would have driven it some other place. And it ended up in this interesting place that's actually maybe better. Maybe I'm better for it. Maybe I've learned more from it. But
exactly.
It's
and I
very,
often find
very rare in the moment that I'm like, oh, this is what God wants me to do.
Right. No, that does not happen. It's not like the Yellow Brick Road.
I wish it did. It's more like, yes. I bungle my way into some situation where I'm like, this is good job, God.
Yeah, no, it's not a Yellow Brick Road. It's not very clear. However, my sponsor did teach me, sort of like in a bit of a crude way. He was like, what's the right thing. He's like, so what he basically teaches me to think about all day long is, what's the next right thing. So like, if I like, I mean, and it even goes down to something stupid. Like, I was just waiting at the lacrosse gym for my kid, and I was like, I deserve a big sugary coffee treat. Exactly, because that's my alcoholic thing. Like, Mickey, I need to reward myself. And if I consume this, it'll make me feel that. And then I stopped myself, and I was like, I don't really want that. So it's like, it's not like, oh my God, I'm so disciplined, but it's like sort of doing the next right thing. When it boils down to like, should I answer this call that I don't want to take from somebody who needs a favor? Yes. Even though before I would probably avoid that call, so it's just like, that's when it's kind of like, there's no like God showing me like, here it is. But like, in general, I have a sense, like, I know I probably need to do this. And it's like, it's the same with getting up and meditating and praying in the morning.
Right.
Like,
I mean, I really want God to come in and be like, Nick, answer the phone.
Right. Exactly.
To be that clear. I did have one experience in the past year where I was really freaked out about something, and I had a moment of peace in it where I was convinced that God would take care of me. I mean, it was crazy, but I was like, this is what people are talking about. I was really stressed out. And then I just like played out all the scenarios, and I was like, I can live with all of those.
Yeah.
All of them. And that to me was the grace of God. I was like, that's God just carrying me through this stress.
Yeah. And I have that type of thing happen often, where it's like, it like a situation doesn't go well, and like I find myself being really like useful to someone else, and it's like, how did I do that?
Yeah,
like, I didn't do that.
My
do you know what I mean?
experience will help somebody else, and that will be its value.
Yeah. And it's not like, again, like I cringe a little hearing myself say this stuff, because it's not like I'm running around like being a patron saint or like a do-gooder everywhere, but it's like, it's just changing my behavior to make it less self-focused and more like focused on others, and it's just like, situational, so like when I hang up this call, I'll probably go like see if I can make the dinner. Whereas before I'd be like, oh, I don't have to make the dinner. Like I can get, you know what I mean?
Well, Terry Brown, thanks for doing this coda, and I'm going to let you go make the dinner.
Awesome. Right? Thank you, man. I can't tell you how much I enjoy these podcasts, and I'm so grateful that you asked me to be a part of it. And I'm so happy to, reconnect with you and share any of these experiences. I never, ever believed that I could be sitting here talking about recovery as if it were something real for me. And so it is very humbling, because it shows me that I do not know, I do not know what's coming.
Thanks for listening. You can support this podcast at patreon.com/thedrunkalogs.